Snow. In August. On a Hawaiian volcano. At nearly 14,000 feet above a warm Pacific, the summit of Mauna Kea was taking wind gusts measured at 140 miles an hour, and conditions up there turned to something that has no business existing inside a tropical system in the middle of summer. Winter, essentially, sitting on top of a hurricane. And while that was happening at the roof of the island, something very different was happening about 8,000 feet below it. Near the town of Naalehu, on the southern tip of Hawaii's Big Island, water rose so fast that local law enforcement reported 2 homes lifted off their foundations and carried away. Same island, same storm, same hour. Hurricane Lala swung within a few dozen miles of the Big Island's southern coast on Saturday, and it brought the island closer to something it hasn't faced in 155 years. 1 person is dead. More than 100,000 electricity customers lost power at the peak. A flash flood emergency, which is the most severe flood alert the National Weather Service can issue, went out for communities where rain was coming down at 3 to 5 inches an hour. And here's the thing, almost every headline you'll read today handles badly. Lala never made landfall. That sounds like the good news. It's not the whole story, and by the end of this you'll know why the number that matters most here has nothing to do with wind speed. If you want the full picture of what this storm did, what it's about to do to the rest of the island chain, and why a team of scientists spent years reading 19th century Hawaiian newspapers to prepare for exactly this scenario, subscribe now, because this one is still in motion. Let's start with what's confirmed, because the ground truth here is dramatic enough without anybody stretching it. Lala spent most of last week as a tropical storm, well southeast of the islands. Governor Josh Green declared a state of emergency on Thursday, ahead of the storm's arrival, activating disaster relief funds and directing state agencies to make their services and facilities available for the response. On Friday, the state announced its National Guard was standing by. Shelters opened. More than 200 flights were canceled across Hawaii on Saturday. Ranchers were told to leave their cattle out in open pasture rather than in barns and structures that might come down on top of them, which tells you exactly how seriously the state was taking this. Then, around 9 in the morning local time on Saturday, the National Hurricane Center upgraded Lala. Maximum sustained winds had climbed to 75 miles an hour. Tropical storm became Category 1 hurricane, and the Big Island went under a hurricane warning while Maui County, Oahu, and Kauai County went under tropical storm warnings. 75 miles an hour is the speed limit on a lot of American highways. The difference is that a highway wind is passing you at that speed for a few seconds. This one leans against your roof, your trees, and your power poles for hours without letting up. The storm's closest approach came around 5 in the afternoon. The National Hurricane Center said the eye wall, the ring of the strongest wind and heaviest rain wrapped around the center, brushed the southern portion of the Big Island from roughly 30 miles offshore. By 7 that evening, Lala had strengthened further to 80 miles an hour, maximum sustained winds, sitting about 40 miles west of South Point and 160 miles southeast of Honolulu, crawling northwest at 9 miles an hour. Minimum central pressure was around 988 millibars. Governor Green confirmed Saturday evening that 1 person had been killed in a storm-related car crash near the southern point of the island. At least 19 buildings lost their roofs. Hawaii County Acting Civil Defense Administrator Daryl Oliveira said in a video update that night that people trapped in a vehicle in floodwater were being rescued. The wind numbers on the ground were serious but survivable in most places. Gusts topped 50 miles an hour widely, exceeded 70 at South Point, and passed 80 in Kohala. Puuloa, at an elevation of about 3,300 feet, reported a sustained wind of 46 with a gust to 69. Even Honolulu's airport, hundreds of miles from the core, clocked a gust of 40. That spread is worth pausing on, because it explains almost everything about how this storm behaved. Lala's hurricane-force winds extended outward only about 35 miles from the center. Its tropical storm-force winds reached as far as 175 to 205 miles. So the destructive core was a circle you could drive across in under an hour, wrapped inside a much larger and much gentler envelope wide enough to touch every island in the chain at once, from the Big Island all the way out to Niihau. That geometry is why Honolulu recorded a gust of 40, while South Point took one past 70 and Kohala took one past 80. A small, tight, violent center skimming the southern edge of a single island, draped in a broad outer field lying over everything else. It's also why the state ended up carrying two different classes of warnings simultaneously, a hurricane warning for Hawaii County and tropical storm warnings covering Maui, Lanai, Molokai, Kahulawe, Oahu, Kauai, and Niihau. The rain is a different category of story altogether. Hawaii County reported accumulations of 5 to 15 inches across windward locations and more than 20 inches in isolated spots. Nahuku, inside Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, had already logged 20.74 inches by Saturday night. Lapahoho, on the northern coast, ran past 25 inches inside 36 hours and, according to later reports, kept climbing past 30. Hakalau also topped 21. Several other sites came in between 19 and 21 inches. Put that in terms you can picture. 20 inches of rain in a single night on one hillside is roughly what Phoenix, Arizona collects in 2.5 average years. If none of it drained anywhere, you'd be wading past your knees across the entire landscape. It doesn't stay put, of course. On a volcanic island, it runs downhill and it runs fast, which is how you get a flash flood emergency for Naalehu, Pahala, and Hawaiian Ocean View, with the Weather Service describing a particularly dangerous situation and telling residents to get to higher ground immediately. Rain was falling at 3 to 5 inches an hour in those bands. At that rate, a flat parking lot gains an inch of standing water in the time it takes you to walk across it and back. On a slope, that water doesn't pool. It picks a channel and becomes a river. 2 homes went with it. It's worth understanding what a flash flood emergency is, because the phrase gets used loosely, and it shouldn't be. The Weather Service runs a ladder of flood alerts. A watch means the conditions could develop. A warning means flooding is happening or about to happen. An emergency sits above both, and it's held back for situations where there's a severe threat to human life and catastrophic damage is underway or imminent. Forecasters don't reach for that rung often. When they do, the wording changes too, which is why the bulletins for the Cow District carried the phrase particularly dangerous situation and told people to move to higher ground immediately rather than the usual advice to avoid unnecessary travel. I've read a lot of these bulletins over the years. The ones that stop you cold are the ones where the language drops all its hedging, and Saturday nights did. Now, the honest part, and it belongs here rather than buried at the end, because a lot of what you'll see online today about this storm is either wrong or deliberately inflated. Lala did not make landfall on Hawaii. The center stayed offshore. The eye wall grazed the island's southern edge and kept going. A hurricane has not made a direct landfall in the state of Hawaii since Iniki struck Kauai in 1992. That record still stands this morning. So when you see a thumbnail claiming Hawaii was flattened, or that a hurricane slammed into the islands, that's not what the data says. And the people who lost roofs, lost power, and lost homes on the Big Island deserve better than that kind of coverage, because what happened to them was real and it doesn't need inflating. Here's the flip side, and this is the part the calm down crowd gets wrong in the other direction. Vanessa Almanza, a National Weather Service meteorologist in Honolulu, put it in one line before the storm arrived. It doesn't take landfall to create destruction. She was right, and Saturday proved it. There's a second piece of calibration worth putting on the table right now, and it involves that spectacular 140-mile-an-hour reading from the top of Mauna Kea. Some outlets logged an even higher gust in the range of 154 miles an hour earlier Saturday afternoon. Those are real measurements. But Mauna Kea's summit sits at 13,803 feet, up in a layer of the atmosphere where extreme gusts are a normal part of life, storm or no storm. Meteorologists who cover Hawaii will tell you flatly that high-end gusts like that are common up there. It's a genuine number, it's a dramatic number, and it is not the number that describes what people at sea level experienced. Anyone showing you that figure as proof of what hit the towns is either confused or hoping you are. Which brings us to the thing that actually did the damage. Think about what a mountain does to a storm. Lala arrived, carrying an enormous load of tropical moisture, moving slowly at 9 to 15 miles an hour. The Big Island rises out of the ocean to nearly 14,000 feet in the space of a few dozen miles. When that moist air is forced up a slope like that, it cools, it can't hold what it's carrying, and it dumps. The island worked like a strainer held under a running tap. The wind went through, the water stayed. There's a reason Hawaii holds some of the most extreme rainfall records on the planet, and it isn't that tropical systems visit often, it's the shape of the place. Warm ocean air arrives loaded with water vapor, meets a wall of volcanic rock that climbs from sea level to alpine altitude across a distance shorter than most people's commute, and has nowhere left to go but up. Rising air cools. Cooling air loses its grip on the moisture it's carrying. That moisture condenses and falls. The process runs continuously on the windward slopes, even in fine weather, which is why one side of these islands is rainforest and the other side is close to desert. Now feed that machine a hurricane. Instead of ordinary trade wind moisture, the slopes receive a tropical cyclone's supply hour after hour, while the storm itself creeps by at a walking pace measured in single digits. The mountain doesn't care whether the center came ashore. It only cares what the air is carrying, and Lala's outer bands were carrying an ocean. If you want proof that this is the real hazard in Hawaii rather than the wind, look at what happened in 2018. Hurricane Lane never made landfall either. It passed about 140 miles from Hawaii Island, and it dropped a record of 58 inches of rain on the slopes of Mauna Kea. Nearly 5 feet of water from a storm that stayed offshore the entire time. 100 people had to evacuate, and 180 structures were damaged. That storm is the template for what Lala just did, and it's the reason Hawaii's own emergency management agency uses it as a case study. That's why the rainfall totals from this storm look so wildly different from place to place. The strainer catches most on the windward and southern slopes, where the air is being shoved uphill, and lets the leeward side off comparatively lightly. It's also why the category number on a hurricane can mislead you so badly in Hawaii. Category is a wind scale. It's calculated from maximum sustained winds at sea level, and it says nothing at all about how much water a storm is carrying or how a mountain is going to wring it out. Lala was a Category 1. In terms of rainfall on a mountainous island, it behaved like something considerably worse. The terrain does one more thing that matters enormously here. The Cow District on the southern flank is steep, and a lot of people there live off the grid in improvised, owner-built housing. That's not a criticism. It's a way of life on that part of the island, and it's a big part of why forecasters kept using the phrase life-threatening mudslides in their public messaging. Steep volcanic ground, saturated for hours, with houses on it that weren't engineered for a river appearing where no river existed the day before. That combination is what took 2 homes away near Naalehu. Let me ask you something while we're here. Have you ever been through a storm where the flooding turned out to be the real threat, not the wind? If you have, tell me where and what the moment was when you realized it. I read those. Now let's deal with the number that headlines everything today, because it's real, it's dramatic, and almost nobody explains it properly. 155 years. That figure comes from research by University of Hawaii atmospheric scientists, and it refers to the last time a hurricane made a direct hit on the Big Island. That storm arrived on the 9th of August, 1871. The last time this island faced what it faced Saturday, the Hawaiian kingdom still had a monarch, and the news traveled by newspaper printed in Hawaiian. Here's the part I find remarkable. For most of the 20th century, that 1871 storm was barely understood. It was known from ship logs and from English-language newspaper accounts, but the details were thin, and after Iniki devastated Kauai in 1992, a working assumption settled in among some people that the Big Island and Maui were somehow shielded, that hurricanes didn't do that to them. Iniki deserves a moment of its own here, because it's the yardstick every Hawaii resident measures against. On the 11th of September, 1992, it came ashore on Kauai as a Category 4 with maximum sustained winds around 145 miles an hour, and the state's own records note gusts reported as high as 227. 6 people were killed, about 1,400 homes were destroyed outright, and thousands more damaged. Something close to 70% of Kauai's homes and businesses were destroyed or damaged. Power and communications were severed across the island, and some areas waited months to get electricity back. It remains the strongest hurricane on record to strike the state. That's what a direct hit on a Hawaiian island looks like, and it explains why the state's posture ahead of Lala was as aggressive as it was. Nobody in Honolulu wanted to find out the hard way whether the last 34 years had been skill or luck. Then a team went and read the Hawaiian-language press. Stephen Businger and Thomas Schroeder, both atmospheric scientists at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, teamed up with Hawaiian-language expert Puakea Nogelmeyer and his graduate students. Between 1834 and 1948, more than 100 independent newspapers were published in Hawaiian, producing what is now the largest archive of indigenous writing in the Western Hemisphere. The team built a database of more than 4,000 articles relating to weather and geology, and they went hunting for the storm. What came out of those translations was a reconstruction. The hurricane came ashore at Waipio, moved on to Kohala, then crossed to Maui, wrecking everything from Hilo to Lahaina. The accounts were detailed enough to work backwards from. Reports described entire houses blown clean away in one valley, with hardly a tree or bush left standing. In Hana, on Maui, residents described wooden houses knocked flat. From damage descriptions like those, Businger and his colleagues were able to estimate the wind speeds required to produce them. Their conclusion, published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society in 2018, was that this had been at least a Category 3 hurricane, possibly a Category 4, making a direct hit on the Big Island and hammering Maui on its way past. Businger described what that discovery changed. Knowing it was a major hurricane that hit the Big Island directly, he said, mattered for decisions about hurricane risk and hurricane insurance across the state. 19th century islanders, writing in their own language about their own destroyed valleys, ended up rewriting a modern risk assessment. That's the real weight behind the 155-year figure. It doesn't mean Hawaii has been safe for a century and a half. It means the last time this exact thing happened, the only people who recorded it properly were writing in a language most modern scientists couldn't read. So why does Hawaii usually escape? 3 things generally save the islands. The water around them is often just slightly too cool to sustain a major hurricane's core. The wind shear in the region, meaning the change in wind speed and direction with height, is climatologically hostile to organized storms and tends to tear them apart as they approach. And the islands themselves, particularly the enormous mass of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, physically disrupt a storm's circulation when it gets close. It's worth knowing where these storms come from, too. Hawaii sits alone in the Central Pacific, and most of the systems that threaten it are born far to the east, off the coasts of Mexico and Central America, then track west across thousands of miles of open water. By the time they reach the longitude of the islands, most have run into cooler sea surface temperatures and that hostile shear, and they come apart. The ones that arrive intact are the ones that found a favorable corridor the entire way across. Lala found one. The state's hurricane season runs from June through November, and the historical peak is August and September, which is exactly where we are on the calendar. That last effect showed up in Lala's own forecast. Meteorologists expected the storm to weaken as it interacted with the Big Island's terrain, and the National Hurricane Center warned of erratic motion during that interaction because a mountain that tall does strange things to a system's steering. But those defenses buy you probability, not immunity. Storms slip through, and when one does, the damage profile is unlike almost anywhere else in the United States because of what the modern island depends on. Take the power grid. At the peak, more than 126,000 utility customers were out across the state, with the vast majority on the Big Island. Remember that a customer is a meter, not a person. 1 meter can be a household of 5 or a business with 20 staff, so the real human number is several times higher. On the Hamakua coast, crews were assessing a 42-mile span of transmission line after wind-toppled trees brought down multiple poles and structures. 42 miles is about an hour of driving, and every pole along it needs eyes on it before anything can be re-energized. 4 of Hawaiian Electric's independent power producers on the island were knocked off the grid entirely, including Puna Geothermal Venture and Hamakua Energy Partners, along with wind operators Hawi Renewable Development and Pakini Nui. With that much generation offline, the utility warned it might have to shed load deliberately, meaning cut power to customers on purpose to keep the remaining system stable. Restoration work had to stop repeatedly because you can't put linemen up a pole in hurricane-force gusts. The Hawaii County Civil Defense Agency asked road and power crews to fall back entirely just after 5 in the evening, saying conditions had degraded to the point where crew safety was the overriding concern. Hawaii County Mayor Kimo Alameda described massive flooding across the island and said outages would likely last days. The county reported a record number of simultaneous road closures. That's the specific vulnerability of an island. There's no neighboring state to drive extra crews in from. Everything, every pole, every transformer, every crew has to already be there or come by ship or plane. What did it feel like on the ground? A few residents described it plainly. Christine Matsuda, in Waimea, on the island's northern side, said big gusts every few minutes rattled the entire house, and that they were finding leaks in places that never see water under normal conditions. Mike Caputo, a fire captain who lives in Keau near the east coast, said his main worry was flash flooding and falling trees, specifically albizia, a fast-growing species that gets enormous without ever getting strong. He'd trimmed his own a few days beforehand. In Hilo, water climbed the banks at the Wainaku Street Bridge while people watched. The disruption ran well past the damage reports. More than 200 flights were canceled across the state on Saturday, which on an island chain doesn't merely inconvenience travelers. It delays crews, supplies, and equipment. Shelters opened ahead of the storm, and at least one of them, the Cow District Gym, lost its own power while sheltering people from the worst of it. Traffic lights went dark across the Big Island. The county described a record number of widespread road closures, which in practice means emergency vehicles running out of routes at the exact moment demand for them spikes. That's the quiet half of a disaster like this one. The photogenic half is water crossing a road. The consequential half is a fire truck that can't reach a house because 3 separate roads are gone and the signals on the 4th are dead. There's a piece of recent history sitting underneath all of this that makes Saturday harder for the island than the raw numbers suggest. In March of this year, a powerful Kona storm, which is a different kind of system entirely, sat over the state and produced some of the worst flooding in years. Kula on Maui recorded 44.37 inches of rain. Mauna Loa on the Big Island took 25.45. Honolulu set a daily rainfall record. Around 125,000 customers lost power. There were swiftwater rescues, landslides, flooded homes and businesses across the southern halves of Maui and the Big Island. That was 5 months ago. Many communities hit by Lala were still working through that recovery when this arrived. Ground that has already been saturated and scoured once responds differently the second time, and the people living on it have already spent their reserves. There's one more hazard from this storm that almost nobody outside Hawaii thinks about, and it's the opposite of flooding. While the windward side drowns, the leeward side gets the wind without the water. Dry, gusty, downslope conditions. That's a fire setup, and Hawaii has learned that lesson at appalling cost. In 2023, the town of Lahaina on Maui burned during extreme winds while a hurricane passed well to the south of the islands. That storm never came close to landfall either. Forecasters flagged elevated fire concern on the dry side of the islands during Lala for exactly that reason. A storm can be a flood emergency and a fire risk at the same time, on the same island chain, on the same afternoon. Very few places on Earth work that way. So where does Lala go from here, and what should you be watching? The storm is turning westward, picking up forward speed, with its core forecast to stay south of the remaining main Hawaiian Islands and the easternmost northwestern Hawaiian Islands into the early part of this week. Weakening is expected as it pulls away and as the Big Island's terrain keeps disrupting it. Tropical storm warnings for Maui County, Oahu, and Kauai County covered the westward spread of damaging wind and heavy rain through Sunday. 3 specific things to watch. First, the flooding threat doesn't end when the wind does. Saturated ground on steep volcanic terrain stays dangerous for a day or more after the rain stops. Landslides frequently arrive after the storm has left, when everyone assumes it's over. That's the classic post-storm killer, and it's live right now on the Big Island. Second, the restoration timeline. Hawaiian Electric told customers to expect extended outages and warned that damage assessments have to be completed before repairs can even begin. With 4 independent power producers offline and a 42-mile transmission span to inspect on the Hamakua coast, the honest answer on full restoration is days, not hours, for some communities. Third, and this is the one most people will miss entirely, Lala isn't finished being a hurricane. Forecasters expect it to weaken as it departs the islands, then possibly re-strengthen later in the week as it moves into the Central Pacific. From there, it could spend a week or more out over open ocean as a hurricane, or, if it crosses the international date line, as a typhoon. It will be far from land, which is the good news, but a system that survives that long is a system worth tracking. And a fourth point, longer range. The Central Pacific season runs through the end of November, and August and September are its historical peak. Lala is one storm in a basin with months of runway left, and the islands have now been reminded twice in 5 months how thin the margin is between a system passing nearby and a system doing real damage. The March Kona storm wasn't a hurricane at all. Lala never made landfall. Both produced flooding emergencies, mass outages, and destroyed homes. If you take one operational lesson out of this, that's it. On these islands, the category number and the landfall question tell you far less about your risk than the rainfall forecast and the shape of the ground you happen to be standing on. One last thing on the rainfall figures, because it's better said plainly now than discovered later. The totals coming out of Hawaii right now vary between sources. The Hurricane Center's forecast maximum was around 25 inches. Some gauge reports have run past 30. Preliminary storm reports get revised, sometimes upward, sometimes down, once they're quality controlled. The order of magnitude is not in question. Parts of that island took more than 2 feet of rain in about a day and a half. The exact peak number will settle in the coming days, and when it does, it may well set a mark that stands for a long time. Here's what Saturday really showed. An island that everybody assumed was statistically protected got close enough to a hurricane to lose a life, lose homes, and lose power across most of its population from a storm that never technically arrived. The record for landfalls in Hawaii is intact. The record for damage without one is not. The 1871 storm is a reminder that the archive is thin, not that the risk is low. It took a team of linguists and atmospheric scientists reading century-and-a-half-old newspapers to prove that the Big Island can take a direct hit from a major hurricane because nobody alive had seen it happen. Lala came within about 30 miles of writing the next chapter. We'll be tracking this one all the way west and watching whether it restrengthens over open water later in the week. Hit subscribe and turn the bell on, and you'll get the update the moment the Hurricane Center calls that turn, plus the final rainfall verification when it lands. The Big Island is still underwater in places this morning. The mountain is still draining, and the Pacific hurricane season has months left to run.